Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We're on episode 12 already. We've crossed the Atlantic Ocean and have been working through the initial English activity in the New World, north of Virginia. We've looked at the people and the situations that provoked both the Plymouth Plantation and the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And they were really quite a contrast, weren't they? And we're going to continue today with one more important colony in those first few decades of English success. And as we mentioned before, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was a numeric success almost out of the gate. I mean, numbers might not guarantee success, but they certainly don't hurt your chances either. And the people involved were invested, not just financially, but physically. They actually moved to the New World. And they were men of means, political influence, and administrative ability. They were skilled craftsmen and largely dedicated Puritans. And with the success, numbers, and increased vision, the past failures began to be mixed with real hope. And as more people came, they began to expand. And as we said before, though they mostly remained within the Puritan camp, differences arose, and this too helped to spread the population farther and farther inland, where other people were already living. And each new settlement added a little to the overall ingredient of politics and worship. And as with many successful ventures, whether it's business, social, political, or religious, there were some people whose names appear over and over again in various regions and colonies throughout the New England stage. And today, we're going to meet another one of those men. Now, previously, we mentioned Lord Warwick, Lord Brooke, and Lord Say and Seal, who had formed Providence Colony in the Spanish Caribbean. And their goal was to establish Protestant colonies to escape the ravages of Catholicism and then Anglicanism. They were looking for autocratic colonies, not democracies. They wanted to model their colonies a lot like the Spanish did. They were English, but they were ardently anti-Spanish. And these men played a role in the affairs of New England. And there's two colonies left that I want to introduce before we develop the broader regional narrative. New Haven, which we're going to cover next episode, and Saybrook, which we'll explore right now, with kind of a little bit of a circling of the drain approach. I think you'll understand what I mean in just a few minutes, and I trust you're going to be able to follow along. Now, this episode's a little shorter probably than most of my episodes. It's because I figured if I did Saybrook and New Haven in the same episode, it may be a little too long. It also may get a little confusing. So I wanted to separate these two colonies. But both of these colonies were located along the opposite shoreline of Long Island. Long Island is that little peninsula that juts out of the bottom of New York City, heading east. The water separating New York City and Connecticut is the Long Island Sound. So these colonies were located just across the Long Island Sound, which was part of the Dutch New Netherlands. Saybrook to the east, with New Haven farther to the west. And again, these are only introductions, so that as we look at the English experience with regards to the various native tribes, the Dutch, and then later the French, there would be much conflict concerning wampum and furs and land. And I say this because there may be some holes in the narrative today, but the goal is to actually introduce and understand Saybrook as a colony, who they were, and then we'll work them into that larger narrative. So as a colony, Saybrook was established in 1635 at the mouth of the Connecticut River, present-day Old Saybrook. And the area was valuable and strategic and had not gone unnoticed. The native population was mainly peaceful and agrarian in the immediate area. They had, however, been subjugated by the dominant Pequot tribe in the final decades of the 16th century. And the Pequots were a very fierce people, and we're going to meet them in just a couple of episodes. The Dutch had been in the area since 1614. They had traveled east from New Amsterdam and attempted to claim the area for New Netherlands. I mean, they were right there. I mean, it's kind of a strategic blunder, in my opinion, that they hadn't already scooped this area up. Their interest was in the fur trade. And we're going to develop that topic again in later episodes. But that said, the Dutch initially established trading posts until about 1623, when they recognized the English threat to their own ambitions. I mean, this looks like kind of a buffer area between the two colonial powers at this point, right? I mean, you've got the Puritans and Plymouth Colony right on the ocean, and then farther in, really, is New Amsterdam in modern New York State. But remember, the English and the Dutch, they'd been pretty good working partners in Europe. Elizabeth helped to fund and secure their independence in the Netherlands, and the Dutch did take part in the conflicts with Spain, as well as both countries capitalizing on piracy around the globe. So in the New World, where they had also teamed up on at least one colonial adventure, they were starting to clash. And this was happening before the English actually wrested New Netherlands from the Dutch and before the multiple wars that these two one-time allies would fight. I mean, there's a lot of money to be made, and money has a way of dividing the best of friends. And so in 1623, the Dutch tried to establish a permanent colony at what was to become Saybrook Point. And you see the foreshadowing and the foreboding right there. The Dutch tried to establish a permanent colony, what was ultimately going to become Saybrook Point. Originally, the idea was that any other colony established in New England would require Plymouth's approval. But by the 1630s, Massachusetts Bay was becoming firmly established. And they were backed by men of influence, and they were looking to expand. Plymouth wasn't going to get that kind of a consideration. In 1631, the Earl of Warwick, who was the president of the Council for New England, deeded a large portion of land to several close friends and relatives. And this was known as the Warwick Patent. It remains controversial to this day. I mean, the question is, if the Earl had the authority to do this at all, was it technically legal? Either way, it was recognized and it was acted upon. And this land is in the current state of Connecticut. So not to be outdone, the following year in 1632, the Dutch intensified their claims to that same area. And Governor Van Twiller of New Amsterdam approached the local natives to officially purchase the land, seemingly from the rightful owners. It's kind of like when they bought Manhattan, right? I mean, you wonder if the natives really thoroughly understood exactly what was going on. But the trading post, Covette's Hook, was established, and the following year, Hook of Hope. Another post was established at today's Hartford. So they created a small foothold in the area with a port fort for trading, and then an internal post farther inland. 3 years later, the English responded to the Dutch attempts with a plan of permanence of their own and with the power to make that happen. I mean, the men behind this were men of ability and means. These were friends of Oliver Cromwell, who was considering moving himself until the Civil War took him in another direction. Anyway, it was our old friends, the Lords Say and Brooke, that lended their support to the new endeavor, which would be named in their honor. And John Winthrop Jr. was tapped as the man who would be the governor of this new settlement. Now, his father was a prominent governor of Massachusetts Bay. And it's in John Winthrop Jr. that we have another example of a more than capable man for leadership. If you recall in the last episode, I developed a small biography around Cotton Mather and talked about the legacy of the Puritans. And this is another guy to take note of. He's a contemporary of the Mather/Cotton clan. You remember Cotton Mather managed to eclipse his grandfather, John Cotton, who had been a formidable preacher, and his father, Increase Mather, who had been the president of Harvard. And Cotton Mather in his own right was renowned. He was a theologian, he was an author, a historian, he was involved in plant hybridization, he promoted inoculations to fight diseases like smallpox. And I think about that, I hate needles. There's very few things in life I have a real fear of, and needles is one of them. I could never be a heroin addict. But I think about needles now, how small they are and how little really they hurt. I mean, it's more of the psychological trauma for me. But think about inoculations back then. That could not have been pleasant. Anyways, Cotton Mather was also an elected fellow of the Royal Society of London, which was a group that he had submitted several scientific reports to. So he was in many ways a real Renaissance man. John Winthrop Jr., he has an impressive resume as well. He's one of those early leaders that compares well to virtually any of the founding fathers that you want to pick that would come about 150 years later. He's another one of those kind of Renaissance men who seem to know a little bit more about everything than everybody else. So just as a quick note, a glance at his resume, and I got these stats from the Museum of Connecticut History.com. He was educated at Trinity College in Ireland and studied law in England. Winthrop Jr. went to sea as a secretary of a captain on a military expedition. He traveled to France and Turkey, Italy, and Holland. And later he returned to England to oversee his father's affairs when Winthrop Sr. went to Massachusetts Bay. You remember, if you were going to be involved in that colony, you had to move there. Winthrop Jr. returned to England and looked over not only his father's business, but the family. In addition to his education and travel, he was a chemist, a scientist. He started one of the first ironworks in Massachusetts Bay. He developed mines. He studied minerals and acquired mineral rights in Connecticut. He experimented with obtaining salt from evaporated seawater. And he was a physician who averaged 12 patients a day, serving an estimated 500 families. Think about that. In today's world, that's a busy, successful guy. Think about that 400 years ago. This is a man of accomplishment. He was well known and respected throughout New England, so much so that New Haven, a colony we're going to look at next week, a relatively closed society, even in Puritan terms, invited him to move there, which he did for a time. So now back to our chronology. Eventually, the following year in 1631, Winthrop Jr. and his family traveled to Massachusetts Bay as well. And he went on to establish a settlement at Agawam, known as Ipswich now, where his wife and baby daughter would die. And it was 4 years later in 1635 that he got the call from the Lords to establish a colony on the mouth of the Connecticut River, and he was going to be governor. So back to the story of Saybrook. In November of 1635, 20 men and 2 cannons arrived at Saybrook Point and secured it from the Dutch. The goal was to build a fort and to lay out plans for a town to accommodate the deed holders. And in March of the following year, in 1636, Lyon Gardner began the construction of a fort. And Winthrop arrived on the scene in April and stayed until his commission expired in July of that year. That's not the last we hear of Winthrop, though. As for him, his post-governorship of Saybrook, he remained influential and went on to be instrumental in the development of Fisher's Island and today's New London. Winthrop remained active in the politics of Massachusetts Bay as well as Connecticut, at a time when many smaller settlements were being absorbed into the larger colony. And herein laid one of the future problems. Connecticut was never chartered. It had populated through overflow and opportunity. I mean, we've talked about the concept of expediency, political or social expediency, the idea of getting things done from a practical standpoint, if not a legal one. Again, the example I like to use is the Louisiana Purchase that would come, a couple of hundred years later. But Thomas Jefferson did not have the constitutional authority to make that purchase. But it was good for the country, and they made it happen. This is kind of how Connecticut was founded by the English. We can all understand the idea of expediency in our own lives as well. So while there was political unrest in England, and it was almost like nobody was paying much attention, the population just kind of expanded. Then there was the English Civil War, and then there was the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. And then there was someone paying attention, someone trying to size up the loyalty of his subjects. In 1660, Charles II assumed the throne, and Connecticut had no legal standing. It was a good pickup for England, but it wasn't a legal pickup. And it was John Winthrop Jr. who secured the charter after the fact in 1662. And it was this same charter that brought New Haven onto the larger Connecticut colony. That was not without controversy in and of itself. So anyways, back to Saybrook for now. The fort that was built was strong. It had to be. There were not only several native tribes in the area, but this fort controlled the main trade route to the upper river. It cut the Dutch off completely from easy access to their own trading post. It had the potential to make money. So as a partial recap then, things looked very promising at first, but that soon changed for Saybrook. The climate in England was rapidly deteriorating. Many of the prominent men that had planned to relocate became embroiled in pre-Civil War activities and then the conflict itself. And they never materialized in actually coming to the colonies. Oliver Cromwell, for one, never left England as he had planned. The area did, however, remain pivotal. And as the English gained more and more control of the land, the local natives were friendly, but their Pequot masters were not. And we're going to talk about those relations and how they deteriorated in just a couple of episodes. But to finish our story here for Saybrook, by 1643, the Puritan colonies began to recognize real cooperation and a need for collective security. They were growing, but they were also gaining enemies. And maybe this was the beginning of the Puritan oligarchy. They formed a common defense agreement. It was a military alliance among the quote-unquote United Colonies of New England. Remember, we've mentioned them before. Well, it was the United Puritan Colonies. New Hampshire and Rhode Island and Providence Plantation, they were excluded from this group. They organized under the Articles of Confederation, which represented one of the first constitutions of the American people of Europe. The following year, in 1644, Saybrook was absorbed into the larger Connecticut colony, but it remained very important and very strategic. In 1647, Major John Mason assumed control of Fort Saybrook. Now, Mason was also the commissioner of the United Colonies. He was a chief military officer and a magistrate. He was able to recognize treaties and he helped settle disputes among the natives. And through all of this, Saybrook Point continued to grow and prosper as a trade center, attracting ships from Europe and Africa and South America and the West Indies. This was competition for both the Dutch and their neighboring Puritan colony of New Haven. Saybrook's a forgotten colony with a ton of history. We only introduced them today, and as we'll see in the future episodes, many important events and people were associated with this colony. Working through those events and thinking about how you or I would have acted will really help to make their history come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.